Hi everyone. So in this lecture, we're going to discuss geologic time. And this isn't a specific history of the Earth. That'll be in the next lecture, Earth history. Um, this is more the methods that we use to piece together geologic events in the geologic past or in Earth's history. So if the time of the dinosaurs and the time of the Precambrian explosion and all of that stuff, if that's the results of a process, this would be the methods of that process. So we use certain techniques to figure out the relative sequence of geologic events, and we use certain techniques to figure out the actual ages or dates that those events took place. So let's get into it. So the two main things here that we're going to talk about with geologic time is relative age dating and absolute age dating. So to give you a sense of what these two things mean, I've got a couple slides coming up to kind of illustrate with some events from my life rather than the Earth's life, so to speak. And so on the next two slides, we're going to have events that in the first list, we're going to put them in relative order based on the timing of these events relative to one another, and that's relative age dating. And then we'll assign specific numbers to them, and that's absolute age dating. And one thing I want you to keep in mind is that this is not a complete and accurate list. There's 9 things. I promise I've done more than 9 things in my life. So this list has lots of spaces in between each entry, similar to what we see in the rock record. There's going to be times of deposition, but then there's going to be times in between deposition in certain instances where we're missing big chunks of time. So I'll talk about that a little bit, sort of like pages being ripped out of a book. Okay, so the following events are times from my life, and I'm going to list them first, and then I want you to pause the video and I want you to try to put them in some kind of a relative order. Okay, so let's start with the first one, learn to walk. Then my first car, learning to ride a bike, getting a master's degree, my birth, teaching at GRCC, learning to drive, starting a band in high school, and getting married. So go ahead and pause the video for a moment, and on a piece of paper, I want you to jot down next to each entry what you think happened first, what you think happened second, third, and so on through, I think there's 9 things here, so the 9th thing. So go ahead and do that now. All right. So hopefully you've figured out the order you think this stuff came in, and I will give you that order now. So this is the order of these events relative to one another. So number 1, my birth. Nice, easy place to start. Number 2, learn to walk. Number 3, learn to ride a bike. Number 4, started a band in high school. Notice there was a time when I learned to play the drums somewhere in there, not listed. Learn to drive is 5th. First car, 6th. Got a master's degree, 7th. Big chunk of space in between those last 2 entries. Started teaching at GRCC is 8th. And finally, getting married was 9th. So now I'm going to go ahead and put those things in order from the first thing that happened through the 9th thing that happened. So now we have them in a relative order, relative to one another. And one thing I'd like to point out here is that this could be the description of anybody's life, maybe in the last 60 or 70 years. We don't know when any of this stuff happened. We just know that birth came first and getting married came last, and everything else came in between. But we don't know the actual dates that any of this stuff happened. But when we do some absolute age dating and get some actual dates, then we can put this in a context. So I was born in 1978. I learned to walk in 1979, so I'm told. I learned to ride a bike in 1983. I started a band in high school in 1994. I learned to drive in 1996, got my first car in 1998, got a master's degree in 2022, and started teaching at GRCC in 2022. And then I got married in 2023. So now we have a much clearer picture. We know the relative age of things, and we know the absolute age or the actual dates that each of these things happened. And similarly, we do this with rock units. We can walk up to a rock unit and we can figure out what happened first, what happened next, what happened after that, and so on to the end of the rock unit. But it wasn't until we were able to figure out how to date these absolutely and get actual dates that we were able to put these rocks in some kind of a historical context with actual dates. Okay, so we're going to talk about the methods by which we did both of those things and how that has informed Earth history. So the first person to really start doing this was a fella by the name of James Hutton. Is a Scottish fella, kind of a polymath. He was a meteorologist, he was a biologist, he was a geologist, although there wasn't really geology quite yet at that time. But he was hiking near his home in northern Scotland, and he saw these rocks here, and he started to think, that's weird. These units are tipped, and they're bent, and what's going on here, right? So he started to develop what we call relative age dating, and that helped scientists reconstruct Earth history. And this is based on simple methods that allow them to put rocks in the correct sequence of formation. So here's a cross section of the Grand Canyon, and we've got a nice Vishnu schist down here in the Zoroaster granite. Then we've got some dipped Precambrian sedimentary layers. Then we've got this red line here, which we're calling an angular unconformity. Then we've got some horizontal units here. Then we've got this kind of weird red line here, and then some more horizontal units, another red line, and some more, and then more units going up to the Permian and the Kaibab Plateau. And what relative age dating does is in cross-section, we can look at these units and we can determine the geologic history and understand the processes that shaped each one of these rocks, okay? And in order to do that, we have to put them in order of formation. So we stick to a couple of very simple and clear-cut rules in order to do this. And the first is the principle of original horizontality. And this basically states that layers of sediment are deposited horizontally. And this makes sense if you think about this all being deposited in a marine environment when the ocean was inundating land here, and you had sea level rise, and this would have been at the bottom of the sea or at a shoreline or somewhere like that. You have different depositional layers depositing, and that stuff just falls to the bottom of some kind of a water body, and it just settles at the bottom. And so everything is layered horizontally, okay? So sediment is originally laid down horizontally, is all this says. Then we have the law of superposition, and basically this states that younger units are deposited onto older units. So up here in the top left, we have a tan sediment deposited over some older gray rock here. Then some red layers are deposited over the tan layers. They are younger than the tan layers, and both of them are younger than this gray layer here. And then you have a third layer, which is on top, and it is the youngest of them all, and it is younger than the red layer, the tan layer, and the gray layer. So that's the law of superposition. If it's on bottom, it's older. If it's on top, it's younger. Then we have inclusions, and what this states is that younger sediment or rock can contain pieces of older rock. And what this means is older rock that's been around longer has, if it's exposed to the surface, has been weathered, like you see in that breccia over there on the right. And once it's weathered, those chunks of rock are just sitting on the surface. And as sea level rises again and younger material comes in and is deposited, it's going to preferentially sort of incorporate those weathered boulders into it. And so if you see a layer, and then above it, you see a younger layer with chunks of that older layer in it, that's one way to tell you that you had some kind of erosion happening between those two layers. But it definitely tells you that the layer that produced the chunks of rock is older than the layer those chunks are contained in. And we call these inclusions. So I want you to look at a couple of pictures and determine the relative age of these different sequences. So here we've got a conglomerate, and there's dark basalt here. And this basalt layer is sitting below this conglomerate, and the conglomerate has what in it? Well, it has chunks of that dark basalt. So which one is older? The basalt, correct. And here we have some dark metamorphic rocks, and they're contained within a gray granite matrix, okay? So here we've got sedimentary rock over here containing older chunks of igneous rock in it. Here we've got metamorphic rocks contained inside an igneous rock, okay? But the same rule applies. Here the dark metamorphic rocks would be older than the granite because these dark metamorphic rocks were weathered out and they were basically in chunks somewhere, and then this granite intruded in and incorporated these metamorphic rocks. And this likely happened below the surface in the crust, and this would have happened above the surface, right? Because this is sedimentary and this is ultimately igneous with metamorphic intrusions, or inclusions, I should say. So another rule that we use is cross-cutting relationships. And what this means is younger rock or younger features can cross-cut an older rock or an older feature. And we see that over here. We've got these nice horizontal sedimentary beds over here. And then we've got these fractures or faults moving up through them. And so what came first, the sedimentary rock or the fractures? Well, if you said the sedimentary rocks, you would be correct. Those came first. You cannot fracture a rock that isn't there, right? So basically, these sedimentary rocks were layered down, and then sometime later they were cut by this fault. Similarly, you can see here, just in this one little section here, that this fault moves up and then it kind of stops here, although you kind of do see a little bit of faulting here. That might be later, right? Just because of the weakness of this fault here. So it's likely that these rocks were deposited here, right, across this kind of bend here, and then they were fractured, and then sometime later these other sedimentary rocks were deposited on top of them. So if we were to put this in order, we would say these sedimentary rocks were deposited first, then there was fracturing, then there was weathering, and then there was deposition of more layers. And again, probably these faults continue up through these layers, possibly because they've just been affected by the existence of the faults below them over time. But that may not be the case too. So you really have to be careful about how you, determine cross-cutting relationships and really look at the whole rock. So I was looking over here and I was seeing that this little bit of sedimentary rock here doesn't have the fault going through it. So possibly this was deposited later, though I may be wrong. So down here we have these red layers, and then we have this dark basalt dike here. And what this tells us is that the red layers were laid down first, right? Whatever these may be. And then at some point, this dark basalt made its way through. So we can confidently say that the red layers are older than the dark basalt. Similarly, we've got this dark igneous rock here, and then we've got these tan dikes that are moving through it. And so in this case, we would say that the dark igneous rock is older and the tan dikes intruded into this rock later. So the dikes are younger than the igneous rock here, the dark igneous rock. Then we can also have contact effects. So younger igneous rocks can heat up and metamorphose older rocks that they intrude into or cover in the case of an eruption. And you can observe the boundaries between different rock types. So here we've got this, this country rock here. I'm not sure exactly what it is. Maybe it's a granite, but it's quite possible it could be some kind of a sedimentary rock too. But you had this dark basalt move its way up through, and you'll see this layer here where it's altered the lighter colored rock. And this is a kind of contact metamorphism, which we talked about, right? If this were a sandstone, this contact metamorphic mineral or rock actually might be a quartzite. If this was a limestone, maybe this little areola contact here might be a marble. Okay, so something to think about. And so contact effects here, we have this tan sedimentary rock. Then we've got volcanic ash and blocks, and you can see that there's this kind of layer here that's possibly affected by the ash, the volcanic ash, as it was heated up. So when we're doing these cross sections and we're trying to figure out, based on the rules I just outlined, when we're trying to figure out the relative order of things, we often draw cross sections, right? And here's an actual cross section from a paper. And I'm not sure exactly where this is. There's the Delaware River. So let's say this is on the East Coast, right? And this is what an actual geologic cross-section might look like, where you've got these sedimentary layers that have been folded, and there's some thrust faulting here, some offset. Here's a magmatic intrusion, and so on. And for this class, we're really just going to kind of look at some simpler ones, although they do get a little bit trickier in the lab. But they're all sort of cartoonish like this. And if I was going to put these in a relative order, I would want to look at the law of superposition, right? So what's at the bottom, what's next, what's next. I want to look at cross-cutting relationships like this dike or like this fault here, and try to use the rules I talked about to kind of outline the order of things. But oftentimes you'll get a gap in the record, like those torn out pages in a book that I showed you earlier. So rock layers deposited without any significant interruption. So just a sandstone and then a mudstone and then a limestone and then a mudstone and then a sandstone based on sea level rise. We call these conformable strata. This means they were pretty much underwater the whole time. There wasn't really any kind of an interruption in the deposition. And so that's conformable. So any break in the record, right, where there's a gap between two units where there was no deposition, we call that an unconformity. And there's three main characteristics of unconformities. They imply a significant break in sedimentation. They can also imply erosion or the removal of upper layers of rock. So there would have been rock there and now there's not. And they're commonly caused by uplift followed by erosion. So I've talked about uplift and erosion in previous lectures and in lab a little bit, but just to remind you, uplift is when overburden weight on the crust is relieved either through the melting of glaciers or through the erosion of mountains, and the crust begins to rebound and rise relative to the center of the earth or relative to sea level. I guess you could think about it like that. And so layers that were once commonly buried deep are slowly being raised up, and there's erosional stuff happening at the top. And so it's sort of slowly eroding and scooping away the top layers, thereby causing the lower layers to rise up further and further and eventually be exposed to the surface. And after a time, that area could subside, right? And then deposition could resume, right? So something could happen where sea level comes up again, more layers are deposited, it starts to push that stuff back down again and deposit layers over top of it. So that time between uplift and erosion and the resumption of deposition, that's that little line, which would just be a single line between two layers, can represent an unconformity or a big interruption in deposition. So here's how unconformities form. So here we've got an igneous rock with some sandy layer above it, right? Well, that layer is exposed to the surface. It's exposed to air. It's not underwater. So it's going to slowly start to erode away. That gets us down here to B. Here's the ghost of sediment past, I guess, but that's long gone, right? And so now this igneous rock is exposed and it's beginning to weather, right? So it's leaving chunks of itself behind. Well, then sea level rises up again, and we get a limestone being deposited, or a mudstone being deposited, and a sandstone, and maybe another sandstone or something like that. And so this bottom layer here is sitting over top the igneous rock, and it has chunks of igneous rock in it. And when we have an unconformity with an igneous or metamorphic rock bounded above by sedimentary rock, right? So igneous or metamorphic underlying sedimentary, we call this a nonconformity. And I always remember non is like the word not the same rock type, nonconformity. Okay. Other unconformities generally are between different sedimentary layers. So this is kind of the one where if it's in contact with igneous or metamorphic rock, it's a nonconformity. And so the other types are angular unconformity, and this is when you have tilted or folded rock layers that are overlain by more flat-lying layers of rock, like we see over here, possibly. Maybe we'll, but I definitely have a diagram later to show you this. Then we have a disconformity. This is when you have an unconformity between relatively parallel layers of rock, and these are sedimentary layers of rock, but there's some gap between the deposition of one layer and the deposition of the layer above it. There's some erosional gap between the two when it wasn't being deposited, nothing was being deposited, or something was being deposited and then it eroded away, and so now it's long gone. But we may see chunks of it here and there, so that's how we know. And then again, nonconformity, and this is a nonconformity separates metamorphic and igneous rocks from younger sedimentary rocks. Okay, and the reason I say that is because you can get igneous rocks intruding into sedimentary rocks, and this is not a nonconformity. Okay. Disconformities, nonconformities, and angular unconformities have very much to do with the deposition of sediment over the top of other sediment. Okay. When an igneous rock intrudes into a bunch of sedimentary rocks, that's just an intrusion. Those rocks were already deposited and the igneous rock came in. Okay, so that's not considered an unconformity. So here's what an angular unconformity looks like. So we've got our original horizontal layers being deposited here in a shoreline, right? We had some sea level drop or sea level rise that gave us these different sedimentary rock types, and that's our deposition. So that's A. Then B, you've got some kind of tectonic force that's folding this rock and it's uplifting it here. So we've got this big mountain now. And then if you looked in cross section at the layers, they'd be folded like this into this anticline structure. So that's B. Then over some time, here's the where that mountain used to be, but there's been no deposition. That mountain's been exposed to the surface, and so it, over geologic time, will begin to erode. And so it erodes, and now the cross-section would look something like this, right? Here's where our folded layers are, but they terminate here. They stop at the surface, but these dotted lines tell us kind of where the mountain used to be and where those layers used to be. So this sand layer would have gone up like this, And this mudstone layer would have gone like that. But now that stuff's eroded away, so it's relatively flat here, right, relative to these layers. But then, given the enormity of geologic time, eventually sea level is going to rise again. And when it does, it's going to start depositing layers again. And how does it do that? It deposits them horizontally. And so now we have horizontal layers overlying these folded layers. And so if we were to just take a little snapshot of this spot here, we'd see angled layers butting up against some boundary where there's horizontal layers above. So this boundary, this black line, that's the angular unconformity, okay? So that's how that's formed. And what does an unconformity represent? Well, if we have, let's say, a gray limestone being deposited underwater, then it gets folded and eroded. So here's some streams that were eroding it, and here you can see that those layers have been folded. And then those streams start to deposit conglomerate, right, over the top of it as those streams meander back and forth around the top of the limestone layer. So now you've got this folded limestone layer with this conglomerate deposited on top of it. This space of folding and erosion, right, mostly the erosion, that's what the unconformity represents. It represents the time period where there was erosion due to exposure to the surface, okay? So when you're looking at a cross section and you see an unconformity, it's not enough to just say to me, here's where something was deposited, here's where an unconformity formed. No, the unconformity is the indicator by which we tell the story, okay? So the unconformity is a geologic tool to indicate that there was uplift and erosion, okay? So an unconformity means uplift and erosion. So that's how I'd want you to say it if you were writing out the story of a particular rock face, okay? So I've got a couple pictures here. I want you to try to identify the angular unconformity here. So if you said right here, that's absolutely correct. Here we've got some kind of bedding here that's at some kind of an angle, but then here we've got these flat-lying rocks here. So all these rocks are kind of below the unconformity, and all these rocks are above the unconformity. So at some point in this area's geologic history, all of this stuff down here was deposited, and then some gap happened where that stuff was being eroded, and now deposition had resumed later and deposited these rocks, and now we see them above the unconformity. How about here? Well, here's the angular unconformity, right here. So here's the rocks below the unconformity. You can see they have some dipping beds here. Then we've got the unconformity, and then we've got the rocks sitting above the unconformity, and they're more flat-lying here, okay? And here, this should be fairly obvious to you. Here's the unconformity here. Here's rocks below the unconformity, not horizontal at all. And then here's the rocks above the unconformity, deposited horizontally. So this unconformity represents some uplift and erosion before deposition resumed. So how does a nonconformity form? Well, you've got non-layered rock, like a granite or something like that, that's uplifted and eroded. And then the erosion surface is buried by some kind of deposited sediment. And here's what a nonconformity looks like. So here you've got a granite. So we know granites are intrusive plutons, so they cool slowly in the crust, so they form deep in the crust. But they were uplifted, and erosion was happening above them, allowing them to uplift. And so eventually they were exposed to the surface. They started to erode and leave chunks of themselves behind on top of themselves, but then sea level rose and started to deposit this sandstone. So down here in the bottom layer of this sandstone, we see chunks of granite here and there. But you have a granite and a sandstone, so this is a nonconformity. For disconformities, we'll have some deposition of horizontal layers, in this case a limestone. It's below the sea, right? Then there's weathering that erodes the surface. So some of that limestone might get weathered down as it's exposed to the surface, no longer being deposited. And then sea level rises again, and now we've got more limestone being deposited. And so you'll see a difference in the composition, maybe color, different things that differentiate this limestone from this limestone. So we know that they were deposited at two different times. And we might see chunks of this lighter limestone in this darker limestone. And that tells us for sure there was erosion happening, right? If you see chunks of an older layer and a younger layer, those chunks don't just get there by themselves. They have to be exposed to the wind. They have to be exposed to the atmosphere, right, in order for them to erode. And so those chunks, those erosional features that have been weathered away, if present, means you had this weathering happening up here. So there's two disconformities here. We've got the Cambrian limestone, right? Then we've got a Devonian formation here, and then we've got a Mississippian limestone here. So what kind of unconformity would this be? Well, let's look. We've got the Cambrian down here, right? And that's at about 480 to 540 million years ago. Then we've got the Ordovician and the Silurian, and then the Devonian. And that represents about 80 million years of time. Okay, we don't see any Silurian or Ordovician stuff here. We know that this is Devonian. So that means that there was some gap in deposition here. And I hope you're noticing some of these features here. Then we've got Mississippian limestone, and the Mississippian is all the way up here. Oh, well, not all the way up here. It's actually just right above the Devonian. But these are very much two different time periods. So there's an unconformity as well between those two. So let's find them. Well, that one I think is pretty easy. We've got this Cambrian limestone. It even has some kind of topography here. And this Devonian stuff was deposited right up against it. So it follows the contours of this. So this was probably some kind of shoreline, right? Some kind of rocky shoreline. And here's the sandstone running right up to that limestone. So this would have been limestone exposed at the surface of the sea, right by the beach. And then this Devonian sandstone maybe was just lapping up against that. And it got buried at some point by something and lithified, but then that something got eroded away. And then Mississippian limestone started to deposit on it again after sea level rose. So that's our other disconformity right there. So let's talk about interpreting geologic cross sections using relative age dating. So here we've got something very similar to what you'll see in lab. And basically, everything will be assigned, every kind of layer at least, or a dike or a sill or something like that will have letters ascribed to them, and then you will arrange those letters in order from oldest to youngest. And in this example, pretty much everything follows the order of the letters, right? A was deposited first, then B, then C, right? And then we've got D, E, F, G, H, I, J, and K above. And based on cross-cutting relationships, the presence of unconformities, etc., we could put this in some kind of an order. One thing I want to point out is A, B, and C probably deposited in sequence. Then you've got this layer here, D, which is we're told is a sill, and it's got chunks of C at the bottom, and it's got chunks of E at the top. So in this case, we kind of fall out of order here. C, D, E, probably not, and I'll explain that on the next slide. It was probably C, then E, and then D, because of the presence of these inclusions. So that's something you want to look at. Then we have F cutting across all 5 of those layers. So F was after this deposition. Then there was some kind of uplift well, there was deformation, right? Because these are tilted layers. Then there was some uplift and erosion, as marked by this angular unconformity here. And then G, H, I, J, and K were deposited over the top of all of these units horizontally. So this angular unconformity is the boundary between when this stuff was deformed, uplifted, and eroded, and when deposition resumed with G. So if you were putting this in an order, applying the law of superposition, we know that A, B, C, and E were deposited in that order, right? But then D is a sill, right? A concordant igneous intrusion, which means it exploited these layers horizontally. So it intruded while they were still horizontal. We call that concordant. And if we apply the principle of cross-cutting relationships, this sill has to be younger than A, B, C, and E, right? Further evidence that it's younger, aside from the fact that it just intruded into units, so it has to be younger because those units had to be there first. Again, we see those inclusions of C and E. So we know that E came before D, right? Then we have probably F happened after that. So F intruded in, right, as a dike, and it cut across A, B, C, D, and E. Then some rock was eroded away because we no longer see that dike exposed to the surface over here, right? It's just a flat. So we know that some of this upper layer of rock eroded away after there was deformation. And then once sea level rose and deposition resumed, now we've got G through K depositing over top. And that space between where there was erosion, we would call that an angular unconformity. And then finally, we have this kind of irregular surface here. And that indicates that this stuff is exposed to the surface. And so we would say the order of this is A, B, C, E, D, F, uplift and erosion, G, H, I, J, and K. So for the following couple slides, I'm going to show you some examples, and then I'm going to give you the depositional order. And I'm going to move fairly quickly through these and skip a lot of the explanation, but go ahead and watch these again and sort of follow along and see if you can kind of see the things that I'm looking at to get a sense of what's cross-cutting what and therefore what order things had to happen in. So for number one here, I notice I is at the bottom, right? But it's cutting across a bunch of other stuff, right? It's cutting across this fault, it's cutting across B and E, it's cutting across J, K, F, and so on. So I'm not going to start with I. I'm going to say J was the first thing to be deposited, then K, then F, then H. Then there was tilting and uplift and erosion, producing this line here between these 4 units and B, and that's going to be an angular unconformity. Then B was deposited horizontally. Then G cut up through those first 5 layers, and it stops at the top of B, didn't cut through E. So I know it came before E, G did. Then we've got E. Then we've got faulting, right? Because we see that B and E are offset. Then we have I. I intruded through J, K, F, B, and E, and D, the faulting. And because there's chunks of I in C, I know that I came before C. Then C was deposited, and then A was deposited. Then for number 2, A was deposited first. Then B was deposited. Then C was deposited. Because I've got, okay, sorry, so the C is deposited. Then I have D intruding, because these lines here above and below D represent contact metamorphism, which metamorphosed both B and C. So D intruded. Then E faulted all of those layers. And that is a normal fault because the hang wall is down slope from the foot wall, right? So this was a normal fault. So extension, so divergent boundary. Then I have F being deposited. And I know F is after E because E does not cut across F. Then I have G being deposited. And because I see this dome up here at the top, I know that this was erupted. So this is a volcanic neck that then erupted, leaving a volcanic dome. Then H was deposited over top of that. If G went straight up through H and then the dome was on top, then we could say H came before G. But in this case, G came before H. So H is our youngest layer here. And there's a fish and a dinosaur there, I think. I think it's a dinosaur. So A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H. So convenient. So for this one, right at the bottom here, I see H is pretty dominant here in the bottom of the cross section, but it cuts across a bunch of layers, so I'm going to ignore it for now. I'm going to look for my first sedimentary layer that I see. That's going to be F. So I'm going to say F was deposited first, then E, this layer here, then D, then C, then B, then A, faulted those layers, and the hang wall is dropped down from the foot wall over here on the other side. So this is again a normal fault. As we go from the foot wall to the hang wall, we get younger. So that's again an indication it's a normal fault. Then, so A happened, faulting that. Then we see G and H down here, and they don't cut above this line. So we're going to stop now and figure out what came first, G or H. So what do you think? Well, H cuts across F, E, D, C, and B, right? So, but G cuts over H. So after the faulting of A, or after the A fault of all these layers, then we had H intruding, then we had G intruding through that, then we have I, which is the deposition of this, this soil layer here. Okay, so for this one, let's do the same. So we're going to order this from oldest to youngest. So looking down there at the bottom, we see that we've got some igneous rocks, but they don't intrude into any of the, like G and E I'm talking about, and they don't intrude into any of the sedimentary layers above it. So we just have to figure out which one of those came first. Well, G there has a little section here that is disconnected from the other part of G, whereas E is all connected. So if we thought that G intruded into E, we would see some connection here between these two little units here, but we don't. So we're going to say G started first, G deposited first, and then E came in to that, but neither one of those intrudes into K. So we're going to say that G came first, followed by E. But then we notice that they've got this little fault here, right? Cutting through G and E, but not cutting through K. So we're going to say number 2 came next. That's a fault, and I've outlined some of the faults and other processes that aren't necessarily sedimentary deposition. I've made that font that kind of light blue color to differentiate. So 2 happened then, and then we've got K here depositing, then D depositing above that, then L depositing above that, then A depositing above that, then M, And then we see M here doesn't continue until up here. We see a little slice of M, and none of these folds in these next upper layers are the same geometric pattern as the folds down here. You'll notice, we would expect this conglomerate layer to follow the same fold pattern, and it doesn't. But we do see that B and I, to some extent, follow that same fold pattern. So we're going to say that there was uplift and erosion next between M here and this next layer up here. So we'll say uplift and erosion, and then that next layer, which doesn't have a letter for whatever reason, I'm just going to call it a conglomerate layer, that formed next. Then B was deposited. Then I was deposited here. Now it gets a little dicey, so we want to stop and take stock here. This intrusion, this fault, they all cut through these two cut through these layers. This fault cuts through everything. So I want to just stop and see, okay, how do I start to parse this out? Well, I've got I here. I know that there's an angular unconformity between I and H, right? So I'm going to stop and think about this for a second. These two things, O and 1, they do not cut across H, so one of them came first. Well, they both came before H, but one of them came before the other. I'm going to look at O and I'm going to look at 1, and I'm going to think, well, okay, what's cross-cutting what? Well, O is cross-cutting all of this, so it's going to be next somewhere, but I has offset not only these sedimentary layers, but 1 is offsetting these sedimentary layers, but 1 is also offsetting O. So I'm going to say O, which is an intrusion, is next. Then 1 cuts across that fault there. Then I've got this fault, which cuts across everything, and I've got N, which cuts across that. So I'm going to leave those alone for now, and I'm going to go ahead and say H was next, followed by C up here, then F. And now I have all of those being offset by 3, which is a fault. And then finally, N cuts across 3. That's the intrusion, so that'll be the final one. One thing to point out here that I forgot to put in here, but I'm not going to re-record this slide or redo this slide. I'm just going to tell you. In between this fault here, 1, and H, there was probably uplift and erosion, right? Because we have an angular unconformity here, right? So between 1 and H, there should be uplift and erosion as well. And another thing I want you to think about is along this boundary here with H, we've got an angular unconformity between, let's say, B, I, and H, right? But in these few spots where we have this dike, O, intruding up, in this spot here between H and O, what kind of unconformity do we have? It's not an angular unconformity. It's a nonconformity, because here we've got igneous rock overlain by sedimentary rock. So in this little section here, we've got two unconformities. We've got an angular unconformity between I and H, or B and H here, but we've also got a nonconformity between O and H here. One thing to point out, N is also intruding, and so we have igneous rock here with sedimentary layers over top of it, but this intruded last. It was never exposed to the surface and eroded. It is not a nonconformity. This is just an intrusion, okay? So I want you to keep that in mind. So another thing that sedimentologists like to do is use the process of correlation to sort of connect units or rock formations between different areas, sometimes hundreds of miles apart. So a lot of sedimentary layers are continuous. When they formed, they would have been continuous over hundreds of miles in some cases, as that shallow sea was depositing things kind of all at once. And depending on what kind of stuff was being eroded at the time, that was the sediment that would have been available in the water to deposit. And if we were at an outcrop over here, like this one on the left, we would look at this layer and would say, oh, well, this layer came first, then this one, then this green one, the brown one, blue one, beige one, this light gray, and then these light blue here. And then we might drive, 300 or 400 miles up into another state, and we're looking and we see the same fossils and the same kind of unit, and we say, oh, well, these two must be connected, right? And same with this, we see the same fossils and the same color sediment, same grain size, etc. And so we'll connect those two. Same here, and the same here, and the same here. But at this second location, then we have this like pink layer here with this particular fossil here, and we say, well, we didn't see that over here in this layer, but above this layer we see this crinoid here, and we saw that crinoid on the previous outcrop, and so we'll say, oh, well, in that first outcrop there was erosion of this pink layer. It's no longer present over here, but it is present over here, so we know that now this is an unconformity, whereas we wouldn't have known that before, right? Similarly, if we started at this outcrop, we would follow the sequence up like this, and we would have no idea what came above this crinoid. But if we go to this location over here on the left, we see deposition of this layer here, and then this bluish layer here with the starfish in it. And so we know that there's some missing layer over here that we found in this other outcrop at some other location. And so this is how we often identify unconformities, and we kind of get a relative age of things, and we know when there's missing places and when there's not. And of course, this is all based on whether there's even exposures of this stuff to begin with. And that's why with sedimentology, particularly, but really in all of geology, we might never ever be able to tell the full story of the Earth, because lots of stuff is just erased or missing or gone. And so being a historical science like we are, oftentimes we just take the data that we have and we try to make sense out of it. Okay, so this is that process of correlation. And the more you can correlate layers, the more you get a sort of comprehensive or complete view of the geologic history of a region. And one thing to point out is fossils are super duper important in this process, in the fact that we might see sedimentary layers that have very similar grain sizes and coloring, but it's not until we see fossils that match between the two that we're able to really start to talk about them being the same age, because different organisms evolved during different time periods, and so fossils are an excellent marker. And so we often use fossils in this process of correlation. So let's spend some time talking about fossils. So first off, let's talk about how organisms are preserved. So again, fossils are the remains of organisms, and normally when organisms die, they decompose and they're eaten up either by bacteria or by predators or scavengers. But every once in a while that doesn't happen, and when it doesn't happen, sometimes these things can be buried and preserved in the rock record. So the first thing is if there's any kind of shells or hard parts on a fossil, oftentimes that can be preserved. We barely ever get soft tissues preserved. But if we have shells or hard parts, those can be preserved directly in the rock record. Similarly, any kind of bones, and this is most common when we get to vertebrates, obviously, like dinosaurs, lots of dinosaur bones, and those are the actual bones that are that they're digging up there. And this is when an animal dies and is immediately buried, usually in a mudstone or something like that, like a shale, and that mud will preserve those fossils from decomposing. We can get replacement. That's when some kind of organic material is buried in the ground, and then some mineral comes along later and replaces that material. So hydrothermal fluids will come in and they'll dissolve that bone down, and whatever minerals were dissolved in that material will fill in that space, and so we can get replacement. You can get a cast or a mold. So in this case, you've got these shelled uh, organisms down here. The shell was buried by something, by mud or limestone. It then dissolved, leaving behind this, this kind of empty, hollow space, and we call that a mold. And sometimes material can then come through and fill in that space, and we call that a cast. Sometimes with plant material, and we have this at Grand Ledge here in Michigan over by Lansing. Sometimes plant material that's obviously made of carbon will get buried and leave behind a thin layer of carbon, and we call that a thin carbon film. And that's the actual carbon from the leaf um, that was left behind, and super delicate. If you find one of these, don't blow on it, don't brush it, because that's the actual carbon sitting there. So you want to keep that really safe. Then we have impressions. So sometimes that carbon material, in this case, the carbon material that made up a fish that was squished in this layer, that carbon might get dissolved away, but it might still leave an impression in the overlying sedimentary rock that fell down over top of it, leaving an impression of the organism behind. Just like in Jurassic Park, we can get different creatures, insects mostly, encased in tree amber. That tree sap will fossilize into amber, and the organism can be basically encased in that. And so that's an amber fossil. Sorry, DNA doesn't last long enough for us to extract it and make it into a theme park, but that's what Hollywood's good at. And sometimes you can get constructed features. This here is a stromatolite, which we'll talk about in Earth history, and we talked about a little bit in previous chapters. But this is where constructed material like this algal bloom, but sometimes corals and things like that, can be encased. And this is where sediment that was involved in the construction of the organism is left behind. And while the actual parts of the organism, in this case a stromatolite, which is a bacterial clump, the organic parts of that bacteria are long gone, but the sediments that it used to construct its kind of colony are still around, and so we see that in the fossil record as well. We also have not the actual direct fossilized organism itself, but rather evidence that it was there at one point, and we call these trace fossils. And these are traces of organisms in the rock record. Famously in upstate New York, we have dinosaur footprints. So this is an actual footprint left in a shale. So there was a dinosaur moving across kind of a mucky, muddy wetland, left this footprint behind, and before that footprint was able to fill in and with other mud and kind of go away, this was suddenly buried by some other sediment and lithified into rock. And then that sediment that buried it has long since been eroded away, leaving behind this harder rock that has the trace footprint inside it. So when we see trace fossils, we can infer all kinds of things about it. So if we're looking at this footprint, you can tell obviously how many toes it had. So you can tell something about just the structure of the foot itself. But based on the indentation, you can get a sense of the weight distribution on the foot. So you can get a sense of how big the animal was, how it shifted its weight, so how its legs were positioned, how its back was positioned. Did it lean forward? Did it lean back? Did the leg come away from the foot at an angle towards the hip, or did it come straight up? All sorts of things, paleontologists are super interested in, and you can do this with trace fossils, which is pretty cool. And then we also have burrows of worms, etc. So these are worm burrows that got filled in by other sediment, and I have a bunch of this in the lab if you want to check it out. But we can get trace fossils like this Burrows and different habitats where ancient worms maybe would have made their home. And based on the shape of these burrows and whatnot, you can kind of get a sense of the kind of the morphology of the body type of that creature. You can tell how big it is, things like that, but also maybe some of its bodily structures based on how these bend and curve. Like, was it a long creature? And if it was, it must have had a segmented body so that it was able to make these sharp turns and things like that. So paleontologists are very interested in this as well. So again, what determines whether or not an organism leaves behind fossil evidence has to do with whether or not it has hard parts incorporated into its structures or not. So hard parts are number one, and then rapid burial is the other thing. So if this crinoid here were to die at the bottom of the ocean, most likely something would come along and eat it. So something had to bury it very quickly in order for it to be protected from any kind of scavenging. And so hard parts and rapid burial are the key to any kind of fossil preservation. And it's really crazy when you start to think about this kind of stuff, because the amount of things that have to go right for a fossil to be present is pretty crazy. And it's amazing we have as many fossils as we do. Based on natural processes, it's really remarkable that there's as many fossils around the planet as there are. And I mean, there's places you can go to down in southern Indiana, southern Ohio, northern Kentucky, where there's whole outcrops and road cuts just made entirely of fossils. Pretty amazing that the conditions exist for us to have them. And so we're lucky for it, obviously. And one thing I want to talk about with fossils also is the sequence that fossils appear in the fossil record, and how fossils appear over time. So the things that we see are single-celled organisms are always in layers below multi-celled organisms, right? Single-celled organisms definitely evolved before multi-celled organisms. We find them lower in the rock record, right? So they deposited first, therefore they're older. We always see plant fossils in the rock record before we see animal fossils, okay? If we see early plant fossils, we don't see animal fossils below them, right? Plants evolved before animals. We always see invertebrates before vertebrates in the rock record. Invertebrates evolved first, then vertebrates. We don't have any rabbits in the Precambrian, is a kind of famous example. Fish evolved before amphibians. Amphibians evolved before reptiles. Reptiles evolved before mammals. And then mammals evolved before birds. And as we'll talk about in Earth history, birds are basically dinosaurs. Once mammals kind of took the reins and started to exploit the land after the dinosaurs were gone, the smaller dinosaurs that stuck around after the impact we're going to talk about, they evolved into birds. So this is the sequence we almost always see things in. And the relative order in the fossil record, it never varies. Like I said, we never find rabbits in the Precambrian. We don't find dinosaurs in the Ordovician. We don't find trilobites in the Quaternary. These orders are pretty well established, and we simply don't see them in the rock record varying at all. And this leads me to the last principle in our rules of relative age dating, and that's the principle of fossil succession. And what this principle states is that organisms succeed one another in a definite and determinable order, okay? So in the Precambrian, we basically just had stromatolites. They are in the rock record below all kinds of fish and amphibians and plants that evolved in the Paleozoic. Those are all below animals that evolved in the Mesozoic, namely dinosaurs. And those are all below animals that evolved in the Cenozoic, namely mammals and megafauna that we see. And this slide is kind of a preview of what we're going to talk about in Earth history, but I I wanted to, since we're talking about fossils, I wanted to include it. So this is how fossils kind of vary with age, generally speaking. So down here, we've got the Precambrian, and then followed by, and that's from the formation of the Earth up till about 550 or so million years. Then from 542 to 250, we've got the Paleozoic. Then from 250 million years ago to about 65 million years ago, we have the Mesozoic. And then from the 65 million years ago to the present, we have the Cenozoic. Precambrian just means before the Cambrian, which is the first era in the Paleozoic. Paleozoic means early life. Mesozoic means middle life. And Cenozoic means new life. And they're characterized by very specific kind of telltale fossils. In the Precambrian, we have really, this is before the Cambrian explosion. This is before lots of multicellular life and before life started to form tissues. And so here we just see lots of bacteria, and then the most advanced bacteria are these kind of algal clumps of bacteria, and we call those stromatolites. They look like this. Then in the Paleozoic, this is sort of the age of corals and fish, and the early evolution of insects and amphibians, which are the guys that kind of branch sea life from continental life. And these are all found in the oceans, or at least begin their life cycle in the ocean. So the Paleozoic, you know, when you think the Paleozoic, and it's nice that it's in blue here, think oceans, okay? Life was dominant in the oceans, not much going on land necessarily. Then in the Mesozoic, that's when we really start to see land life take off. So amphibians evolved into reptiles, and then those reptiles evolved into famously dinosaurs. And this is where we see ocean plants begin to make their way onto land, and we start to see the evolution and rise of flowering plants, and also conifers too, things like that. Conifers, we call that kind of group where they reproduce not by flowering, but usually through cones or spores. We often call those gymnospores, and then the flowering plants we call angiosperms. But the dinosaurs and flowering plants and like mosses and things like that are all dominant here. And then in the Cenozoic, that's where we start to get mammals, and then we start to see the evolution of grasses and mammals evolving in conjunction with the evolution of grasses. And that happened in the Cenozoic, and that's us. So we evolved in the Cenozoic as well. So let's look at how fossils change over time in the sequence of sedimentary rocks. So here's a sedimentary rock sequence over here on the right. And there's some trilobite fossils down here. Here's some more trilobite fossils up through this layer here. And then we've got some other fossils here, some crinoids and some other things. And then we've got some corals and some bryophytes, and then we start to see some shelled fossils here, and then we start to see some other shelled fossils with different different body forms or different morphologies up top. And there's some things to notice about this. So the first thing, that fossils tend to change up section in a systematic way. Generally, let's say this trilobite down here might have a more simple form, and then the trilobite above it might build on that same form, but start to evolve or develop some other body parts that make it a little bit more complex, right? So we see that evolution of different body forms builds on the evolution of the body forms before it. And so oftentimes complexity, although that's not always the case, but oftentimes the complexity within species as they evolve into other species works its way up. So things get a little bit more complex as you work your way up the rock sequence. Some species will live a short time, like this brachiopod here, F. And that short lifespan gives us a narrow time range. So we're only going to see that fossil in this very narrow section of the rock record. And if they're geographically widespread, that is, if we see this particular body style of brachiopod, and it's a thin layer, right? It only appears very briefly in time. If we see that all across the Earth, we use that and we call that an index fossil. So we know that that's a very short time period. So if we see that fossil, we know everything below it is younger and everything above it, or sorry, everything below it is older and everything above it is younger. And sometimes we'll use that fossil to index sedimentary layers across the entire planet. So we'll use that little thin layer where F appears, and we'll tie that in with where we see F in China and where we see F in India and where we see it in Australia and where we see it in France and where we see it in Peru. And we can use that as a marker to correlate sedimentary layers across these vast different distances. Some have spanned long time frames, like G here. Some fossils overlap. So if you have G, it spans a long time, and then you've got H here, there was a time in between the end of H, or end of G right here, and the beginning of H, where there's this little sliver right here. And if we look over in the fossil record, we see G and H existing simultaneously, okay? And so we might see G all over down here. We might see H all over up here. But if we see G and H in the same place, we know that we're in this one little time period here. And so that can constrain the age of that sedimentary rock. If we want to know the age when this rock was deposited, we know it was when G hadn't died yet and H had already started. And so we use that to date things as well. So here's two rock sections that contain many of the same fossils, and I want you to pause this and I want you to take a minute and match the two sections, okay? And I want you to envision, just like we did before when I was showing you the correlation slide, I want you to try to connect these two together based on the type of rock you see and the fossils that you see. So go ahead and do that now. Good. So you should have something that looks somewhat like this. So we just basically find the border between A and C, and we make a line going to the border of the top of A here, because notice this fossil is not over here, right? So C has eroded over here, but it's still present over here. So this we call a pinch out, where somewhere along this area, no matter how far apart these two rock units are, C is no longer present over here. So this is an unconformity here, and it is a disconformity. Ding, 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 you got it right. Now, here's F. We go from the top of F, and we go over to the top of F over here. So here's that layer correlated here. Then we'll go from the top of G to the top of G here. That correlates these two. Then we've got H over here, but we don't see that fossil over here. So H pinches out before it gets over here. So this, again, is another disconformity. And then we have I over here, and we'll go from the bottom of I to the bottom of I there, and the top of I to the top of I there. So that means somewhere in between these spaces, either these ones that are no longer present either eroded away, or that layer just didn't make it over here, right? This might have been a shoreline that just disappears over here. The water didn't rise up that far over on this side or something like that. So that's how we match rock sections. And here I want you to look at these two layers here. So we've got this layer over here on the left with some basement unit here, 1, and then an unconformity, and then unit 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, etc. And then over here, we've got another unit, and it's got some of the same rocks, and it's missing some of the others. And it has some that this one doesn't. So I want you to look at how the thicknesses vary between the two. And using both, we can reconstruct a more complete section. So We have 1, 2, and 3 over here. They're not present over here. So once we get to 4 here, we see it's the same rock as over here. And we know that because we see similar layers on top of it. We're going to go ahead and connect 4 to 4 here. Then 5 is thin here, but it's thicker here. So we draw that like that. Then 6 will go from the bottom to the bottom of 6 here, and from the top of 6 to the top of 6 over here. And so we've now filled in a space between these two layers that give us a more complete section of 4, 5, and 6. And then if we were in the field, let's say this is 150 miles away from this, we would go in between the two and we would drill and we would see if our calculations were correct about the thicknesses here. And then similarly, in the right here, we've got layers that we didn't have over here, and that's going to be 7, 8, and 9. And so when we put all that together, we can say that the sedimentation of this area, or the deposition of this area, if we put them together, would have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and 9, right? So if we're talking about the geology of a larger area, we would go ahead and include all of these units, even though some are visible here and some are visible here. When we put them together, we get that more complete picture. Here is a nice reference that I wanted to post, and I'll put it up separate on Blackboard as well, because this is handy to use in lab and is handy to use on the test. And this is some common index fossils that we use, and their time periods where they appear. So the black line next to each organism is where they appear in the fossil record. And you'll notice that there's overlap here between the Mucrospirifer and sharks. And so if you see Mucrospirifer and sharks in the same layer, you're in the upper Devonian, right? Because there are no sharks in the lower Devonian and down into the Silurian, Ordovician, Cambrian. And there are no Mucrospirifers in the Mississippian and above. So if you find a sandstone or a mudstone that has shark fossils and this brachiopod fossil here, you're in the upper Devonian, and boom, you've just dated your sedimentary layer. And then you can pull in some of these other guys that were evolving around the same time, and that helps you even more closely define the age of that rock. So this is a real handy thing to use. And one thing I want to point out, it's not so pertinent necessarily to anything we're going to do in class, but I just think it's super interesting. Sharks evolved about 370 million years ago. And for the most part, the current body type and structure of the shark has been fairly unchanged for most of this time. It's kind of crazy. Sharks evolved early, and I've had no reason to really evolve out of that form anytime since. They're kind of perfect. There's no real selective pressure or natural pressures on the shark to adapt through natural selection to improve on itself in any way, which is a weird way to talk about it because that's not quite how evolution works. But for our purposes, it's kind of crazy. Sharks have been around for a long time, and they've remained fairly unchanged, which I find pretty interesting. Here's the geologic cross-section that I posted on Blackboard. This kind of breaks down the different principles that I've just talked about and kind of the definitions of different unconformities with examples. And then when you see features in cross-section, these are the geologic process words that I want you to use if you were ever to describe. So if you see a sedimentary layer, right, a limestone, a sandstone, or a shale, you would say limestone deposited, or sandstone deposited, or shale deposited. If you see any kind of volcanic rock, you would say erupted, like basalt erupted, andesite erupted, lava erupted, rhyolite erupted. If it's intrusive, you would say granite intruded, or diorite intruded, or gabbro intruded. If it's a metamorphic rock, you would say gneiss metamorphosed, or slate metamorphosed, or quartzite metamorphosed. And then with unconformities, you would say uplift and erosion. For faults, you would say tectonic forces like compression. So, compression led to this, or extension led to this. Or if you see tilted layers, you would say compression or extension led to this, and then there was faulting or folding. And then topography, you would say uplift and erosion as well. So this is a nice handy little reference. So this kind of concludes relative age dating. Next, we'll go into absolute age dating, and this is a fantastic time if you want to take a break and maybe come back to the second half of this lecture at another time. This is everything you're going to need for the relative age dating lab, and then after this slide, we're going to go into absolute age dating, and that's not necessary for the relative age dating lab. So you can watch that at a later time if you'd like, although absolute age dating is important and will be on the test. So now's a good time to take a break. You've sat through an hour and 20 minutes of this already, and so I commend you, and I'm going to take a break now as well. So I'll see you on the next slide. So now we're going to move away from relative age dating and talk about absolute age dating. And this is a method that actually assigns a number or an age to a rock or mineral. And it requires a natural clock to do that records the passage of time, sort of like a stopwatch. And that natural clock is radioactive elements. And what a radioactive element is it's an element that spontaneously decays to form other elements. And that decay rate is a measurable rate. So it's constant and it's measurable. And absolute age dating was pioneered by this heartthrob over here, Bertram Boltwood. He was the first to use radiometric age dating. And what he noticed was that the ratio of lead to uranium in uranium-bearing rocks increases with age. So a fairly young rock would have a lot of uranium and less lead, so a low ratio. And then much older rocks would have a lot more lead in them than uranium, and so a much higher ratio of lead to uranium. And what's going on here is that radioactive elements, their nuclei will disintegrate, okay? Oftentimes to form lighter elements. This is because elements that are isotopes and are heavier, they have more neutrons, let's say, and more protons than they like having necessarily. That makes them unstable, and so in order to reach a state of equilibrium where those elements are happy, they often their nuclei will disintegrate to form lighter elements. Or sometimes they'll disintegrate to form isotopes of the same element that have less nuclear material. So usually this is a neutron that would disintegrate and remain the same element but be a lighter version. Think like what we talked about with oxygen 18 and oxygen 16, something like that. So a quick review of atomic chemistry. The nucleus is made up of positively charged protons and neutrally charged neutrons. They have no charge. And a neutron, you can kind of think of it as being made up of a proton plus an electron, right? And those two charges, the positive proton and the negative electron, cancel each other out. And we can think of them as being made up of this because when they decay, this is often the decay products that we see, okay? And what offsets the charge of an atom is usually there's positively charged nuclear material like protons, and usually there's some equal number or one or two less than equal number of electrons, and that offsets the positive charge. But electrons, they don't have any real weight to speak of. In fact, they were often, at one time, they were thought to be weightless, although we know now that electrons do have somewhat of a weight, but they are, infinitesimally smaller than a proton or a neutron. I mean, it's hard to imagine. But when we're looking at an atom, the atomic weight or the mass of that atom is almost always the weight of the protons and the neutrons. This picture here is comical in its sort of early interpretation of electrons revolving around the nucleus like planets around the sun, but also it's not at all to scale. An electron is much, 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 much smaller than this compared to protons and neutrons. So when we're talking about the atomic number of an atom, so let's say, carbon 14, let's say, or carbon 16 or whatever, the atomic number is the number of protons in the nucleus. And that's what makes an atom a certain element, right? Hydrogen has 1 proton. Its atomic number is 1, and that's what makes it a hydrogen. Helium has 2 protons. Its atomic number is 2, and that's what makes it helium. Potassium has 19 protons. Its atomic number is 19, and that's what makes it potassium. Silicon has 14 protons. Its atomic number is 14. That's what makes it silicon, and so on, right? Elements with different atomic weights, however, are called isotopes, and that's usually when there's a different number of neutrons in the nucleus. And we can see that over here with hydrogen. We've got hydrogen, 1 proton, no neutron. That's a stable hydrogen, right? Its atomic weight is actually 1 because it just has 1 proton, and so that's hydrogen. If we were to add a neutron to hydrogen, it still only has 1 proton, so it's still hydrogen, but now its atomic weight is 2, right? So we call that H2, and now it's a hydrogen, but it's a heavier hydrogen. We call it deuterium. And then again, if we add 2 neutrons, it still only has 1 proton, it's still hydrogen, but now its atomic weight is 3. And I want you to differentiate here. Its atomic number is still 1 because it still only has 1 proton. It's still hydrogen, but its atomic weight is 3. And so we call that hydrogen 3, and we call that tritium. So deuterium and tritium are isotopes of hydrogen based on the addition of these neutrons. And for these isotopes, some have unstable nuclei that can spontaneously break apart or decay. This is what radioactivity is. And if you have an unstable or radioactive isotope, we call that the parent. So before it begins to decay, we call that the parent isotope. And then as it decays into another element, the resulting element after the decay, we call the daughter product. And many isotopes have unstable daughter products as well, so that process can continue in many steps of decay, right? So you might have something that was a parent that decays to a daughter, but then that daughter decays to another daughter, and that daughter decays to another daughter, and so on. So you can get this stepwise process. And down here we see an unstable parent atom, right? It's got some number of protons, some number of neutrons, and then it emits an alpha particle, which is in this case a kind of heavy helium, right? It's got 2 protons, but then some number of neutrons, and so now it has a lower atomic number and it has a lower atomic mass. Okay, and so it's decayed from one element into another element. And here's an example of how that works. So this is a very common element used in dating. This is uranium-238. Remember on Looney Tunes, this is the stuff Marvin the Martian was always looking for. Uranium-238. And so this is a very unstable uranium isotope, and its first step is to decay into thorium-234. So it lost 4 protons and some number of neutrons maybe, and then that thorium-234, which is unstable in and of itself because thorium likes to be a different atomic number, that just slowly starts to decay protons, and then it becomes uranium-234, right? Or actually, no, sorry. In this case, actually, it's taking in another element, and it's becoming uranium-234. So it's borrowing protons from another element. Then that decays to thorium-230, which then decays to radium-226, which decays to, what's that one? Let's see, and that's radon. And then radon will decay to polonium-218, which decays to lead-214, etc. Then that goes back to polonium, down to lead again, and so on. And it's got this kind of cascading stepwise fashion. Long story short, uranium-238 decays to lead-206, right? So to determine the absolute age using this method, how does reactivity determine the age of a rock? Well, the decay rate and ratio of the daughter product to the parent is the thing that actually determines the age of the rock. So what's very important here is that decay rates don't vary, okay? Uranium-238 decays to lead-206 at a very consistent rate over millions, if not billions of years. It emits that radioactivity very systematically and precisely, like a clock. And so we call that the radiometric clock. And the radiometric clock starts at the moment of crystallization, so the moment that mineral forms, right? Whatever mineral has uranium in it, like uraninite or zircon. And the moment that cools and crystallizes, that clock starts. That uranium starts to decay, right? This can also happen in metamorphic rocks. So if you melt a mineral just enough that it melts and recrystallizes as a new mineral, that starts the clock over. So as you can imagine, sometimes with metamorphic rocks, you might be able to tell when it metamorphosed based on radioactive decay, but how old the parent rock is, or the source rock that metamorphosed, that clock has been started over. And what's important here is that the daughter products are trapped and accumulate over time. They're trapped in the mineral, in the crystal structure, right? And they don't have anywhere to go, right? As long as the mineral is cool and is whole and not exposed to the outside world at all, you'll basically get something that looks like this down here, where you've got, here's a bunch of, let's say, uranium, right? In these, bound together in these patterns. So then that uranium begins to decay to lead over time. And so some portion of uranium is still present, and some, which is the parent, and then some portion of lead is now present as the daughter. And that ratio can be measured. And then you cut to another time, and now there's still parent left, but more daughter than before, right? Because there's no new parent being added and there's no daughter being added outside of the decay of the parent, and there's no daughter leaving the crystal, okay? And this is where I'd like to introduce a term you've probably heard before, but I'm going to go into some depth about it, and this is called a half-life. And a half-life, put very simply, is the time it takes for there to be an equal portion of parent and daughter isotopes, okay? And that's, half-lives are how the rate of radioactive decay is expressed. And the way it works is like this. When an isotope has gone through one half-life, that means half of the parent has decayed to daughter. So if you had all parent, no daughter, you have a ratio of 1 to 0, right? But then after half of that has decayed, half of the parent has decayed to daughter, now you have 50% parent, 50% daughter, and now your ratio is 50 to 50, or 1 to 1. After two half-lives, the parent daughter ratio of 1 to 1, half of that parent has now decayed to daughter. And so now you have a ratio of 1 to 3. And then after three half-lives, half of that parent again has decayed. And so now you have a ratio of 1 to 7. And then after four half-lives, you have a ratio of 1 to 15. Well, What the heck does that look like? Well, I'll explain further. So here's what that looks like in visual form, kind of in this graph here, which we call the radioactive decay curve. It's a logarithmic curve that scales down here. So it looks kind of like a flipped over exponent a little bit. And over here on the left, you've got at time 0, you have 0 half-lives have transpired. So this is right when the mineral forms. The way we can think of this, if this is uranium, this is all uranium. No half-lives, no decay, no nothing. This is time 0, all parent element. After one half-life takes place, and that time varies depending on the element and on the isotope of that element, one half-life means half the parent has decayed to daughter. So now we see that half of this is now daughter, or in the case I'm using, let's say lead, and half of it is parent. So this is one half-life, and we see 50-50 here. Half daughter, half parent. Then that daughter is carried over. It's still around. It's not decaying anymore. But this parent is continuing to decay. So after another half-life, now half of the parent that was left over from the first half-life has decayed to daughter. So now this, after 2 half-lives, we have 1/4 parent and 3/4 daughter. So now our ratio is 1:3, parent to daughter. Okay. Then that daughter gets carried over, right? It's not decaying anymore, so it moves over. And now half of this parent will decay. And now we have 1/8 parent to 7/8 daughter. And so after 1, 2, 3 half-lives, now we have a ratio of 1 to 7, parent to daughter. Then at 4 half-lives, half of this parent has now decayed. And now we see 1/16 parent to 15/16 daughter. So now our ratio is 1 to 15. And then finally, after 5 half-lives, which is really where things start to get so small it's hard to measure, now half of this parent has decayed to 1/32 parent to 31/32 daughter. And so the ratio here is 1 to 31. Okay, so that's how that works. And I hope that makes sense. If not, please raise your hand in lab and I will explain this further. So here's how we use all of that to calculate the age of a rock, well, or a mineral contained within a rock. If we know the half-life of a radioactive isotope, and we do for a number of them, and we know the ratio of the parent to the daughter, and it can be measured, then we can calculate the age of the rock. And basically what we do is the age is equal to the length of the half-life. So in the case of uranium, it's 1 billion years. For 100% uranium to decay to 50% uranium, 50% lead. So that's 1 billion years. And we know the ratio, in this case 50-50, we know 1 half-life has taken place. And so we know that in this example here, 1 half-life has gone by, 1 billion years old. So let's take the example here of isotope Z, and it has a half-life of 1 billion years, and its parent to daughter ratio in the rock is 1 to 15. Okay, so from 0 to 1 half-life is 1 billion years, and the ratio is 50-50, so this is 1 billion years old. Then we go down here, we measure the ratio, and it's 1 to 3, so we know 2 half-lives have taken place, so that is 2 billion years old. Then we get down here, and we have a ratio of 1 to 7. We know 3 half-lives have taken place, so we know that this is 3 billion years old. And then if one more half-life had taken place, and we see that the ratio is 1 to 15, we know 4 half-lives has taken place, so we know that the next step in this mineral's decay would show that it's 4 billion years old. And here's some frequently used isotopes in radiometric dating for rocks. You got uranium to lead dating, and the half-life from uranium-238 to lead-206 currently is accepted at 4.5 billion years old. So if we see 50% uranium-238 to 50% lead-206 in a mineral, we know 4.5 billion years has gone by. If we have uranium-235 to lead-207, its half-life is 713 million years. So if we see 50-50 of that, we know that 700 million years has gone by, and so on with these other ones here. So these are the most common ones that we use. And I want to point out that we're not measuring perfect ratio half-lives all the time. It's never like that, right? It would be rare that you're exactly 4.5 billion years from the formation of that mineral here, the formation of that half-life. So we're always in some space in between, and I'll show you a chart that illustrates what that looks like. So potassium-40 to potassium-argon, we use that to date things. The half-life of potassium is 1.3 billion years. And this is widely used because it has good analytical techniques that allow the detection of really minute amounts of the daughter product, argon, in rocks that are younger than 100,000 years. So, and since potassium is an abundant element in many minerals, we use potassium-argon a lot to date minerals because uranium-lead or strontium-rubidium, some of the other dating elements aren't as common, but potassium is super duper common, so we use it a lot. Particularly, we use it when we're dating feldspars, and you guys will all recognize this one as potassium feldspar. And then potassium is really prevalent in lots of micas, and since potassium feldspar and mica are in lots and lots and lots of rocks, we use that to date lots of rocks because we can go in, crush a little piece of this potassium feldspar up, measure how much potassium-40 there is to argon, and we can date these rocks as young as 100,000 years, or as old as 1.3 billion years. Okay, because we're able to. There's enough potassium in there and enough argon in there that that the potassium decayed to that we can figure that out. This is the machine that we use to do such a thing. This is a machine that specifically dates potassium-argon. So potassium-40, whose atomic number is 19, decays to argon-40, whose atomic number is 18, basically by electron capture. So for the age, we can measure the potassium-40 to argon-40 ratio and figure out how many half-lives or fractions of half-lives have taken place. And then we can figure out how old that rock is. One thing that happens is argon is a gas, and so argon gas can be lost during the process. And if that happens, you might underestimate the age, right? Because you might think that there is less argon in there than there actually was, and so you're going to say that the mineral is much younger than it actually is. So to minimize that error, we always have to use fresh, unaltered samples. So usually we don't date things that are on the surface of the rock. We'll break the rock up and we'll find a mineral deep inside the rock that hasn't been exposed to the atmosphere, hasn't been exposed to cosmic rays, anything like that. And we want to make sure that it's not metamorphosed at all, because metamorphism, as I mentioned, will reset clocks oftentimes, or it'll introduce more potassium or less potassium, or more argon and less argon, and it can give us false dates. And then we'll also use additional radiometric dating. So we'll try to find other minerals containing other elements, and we'll try to date those as well in the same rock and see if we come up with similar ages. So that's all fine and good for rocks and sort of time scales that we use for rocks, but a lot of those elements they have too long a half-life for us to date anything that happened super recently, like let's say 2,000 years ago, or 5,000 years ago, or 10,000 years ago. And for that, we use carbon-14, and we use this primarily on living things, right? Because all living things are respirating or exchanging gases with the atmosphere on some level. And there is a constant amount of carbon-14, which is the unstable isotope of carbon, and there's a constant amount in all living things, right? There's atmospheric proportions of carbon-14 in all living things. When you breathe in a breath, you're breathing in oxygen and nitrogen and all that stuff, but you're breathing in carbon dioxide as well. And that carbon dioxide has a set proportion of carbon-14 to carbon-12, right? Which is the stable isotope of carbon, carbon-12. Natural processes don't really change that ratio very much, so every breath of air has pretty much the same proportion of carbon-14 to carbon-12. When you die, or an organism dies, you stop exchanging gases with the atmosphere. And so you have a set amount of carbon-14 now in your body, and that's going to be, at time 0, that's going to be the regular proportion of carbon-14 to carbon-12 that we see in the atmosphere. So as you stop exchanging that, and that carbon-14 ratio is locked in, that carbon-14 starts to decay to carbon-12. And then at any point in the future, someone can come and take samples of your tissue, and they can find some ratio of carbon-14 to carbon-12 that is less than the ratio of carbon-14 to carbon-12 in the atmosphere. And so we know the decay rate of carbon, we know the ratio of carbon-12 to carbon-14 in your body, so we know how long you haven't been breathing. And so we know when you died, and consequently, when you were alive. So the half-life of carbon-14 is only about 5,730 years. After several half-lives, there's such a minute amount of carbon-14, the parent, left that dating is useless. And so we don't use it for rocks, hardly at all, and definitely not old rocks. And for carbon-14, it's best used to date rocks a few hundred years to about 40 to 50,000 years old. And so for rocks, carbon-14 is good for young stuff, but for organic materials and things that are made from organic materials by early humans, this is a fantastic method. You can grab a canoe, and you can measure the carbon-14 to carbon-12 in a canoe, and so you know when that tree was cut down, so you know exactly when that canoe was made. You can date bones this way. You can date textiles this way, because any textile that was woven from wool can tell you exactly when that wool was sheared off the sheep and probably spun into clothing. So this is how we can carbon date all manner of organic materials and textiles and building materials and things. We know when houses were built. We know when forests were cut down. We know when a person died. We know when they built a bowl or a canoe or anything, because we know when that material stopped exchanging gases with the atmosphere. So this is basically how we do carbon dating, which you've probably all heard thrown around a ton. Carbon dating, carbon dating. This is how it's done. So let's look at how we use absolute age dating and relate it to relative age dating and come up with timescales. So we have some sedimentary rocks here. We're not going to necessarily get great absolute age dates out of those. And why do you think that might be? Well, sedimentary layers are made of weathered rocks, right? And so if we find, let's say, a little zircon grain in a mudstone, let's say, that doesn't tell us when the mudstone was deposited. That tells us when the zircon grain was formed. So basically what that tells us is there were micas that had zircons in them. They formed X number of millions or hundreds of millions or billions of years ago. And then over time it weathered, became sediment, then became mud, then became mudstone. So we know when the parent or the source rock of that mudstone formed, but we don't know when that mudstone layer was deposited. But let's say we get a volcanic layer that intrudes into a mudstone right in the middle. And so below that we have a unit of mudstone, and then above that volcanic layer we have that same unit of mudstone, but that volcanic layer, didn't intrude. That volcanic layer erupted. And so now we can get an absolute age date from that volcanic layer, because that volcanic layer erupted and those things cooled very quickly on the surface as this mud was being deposited. And so now right in the middle of this mudstone layer, we have a unit we can date, absolutely, right? Because we can get some kind of igneous material out of that and use radiometric dating to get an age. So now we know the relative age of the deposition of that mudstone. And we know everything above it is younger than that age and everything below it is older than that age. We can also use it to date a dike or a clast. So if we've got a dike here, we can't get age dates from anything that it intruded into, similar to what I talked about over here with the mudstone, but that dike cross-cuts lots of things, and that dike has minerals in it that we can age date because that dike cooled at a certain time as it was cross-cutting through these units. So we know that all these units are younger than that dike. And then if we have clasts of that dike in a sedimentary layer above it, we can basically say, well, if this happened at 50 million years ago, we know that this happened after 50 million years ago, and this happened before 50 million years ago. And then similarly, you saw on that one reference sheet with all the fossils, you saw ages next to all those fossils. And so how do we know that? How do we know the age of different fossils? Well, if we have a volcanic unit, and then we have some fossil-bearing bed that deposited over that volcanic unit, and then we have a volcanic unit above it, and by the way, this is very common. We find this all over the planet. We can basically take the age of this volcanic unit that we can absolute age date through radiometric dating, and we can take the age of this volcanic unit up here, and then we know that this fossil-bearing bed fell between these two absolute dates. And so whatever fossils are in there, we know those fossils existed during that date. And if we have enough of these all over the place, we can start to constrain when these fossils were evolving on the planet. And so that's how we have ages for fossils. We can then take those ages for fossils, and we can use them to further define the ages of rock formations. So if we have some conglomerate layer here and some sandstone layer here, but in between it, we have a fossil-bearing layer, and we used volcanics to figure out in the previous slide how old those fossils are. Now we have an age of formation of this fossil-bearing unit, and we can say everything above it is younger and everything below it is older. And so that helps us put those relative age dating of these units into some kind of actual date. And similarly, we can do that with unconformities. If there's a fossil-bearing layer above an unconformity, we know all the deformation of these units down here happened before the age of this fossil here, and all this sediment was deposited after. And the same with a granite intrusion. If we have a fossil-bearing layer here, we see a granite intrusion, but it doesn't cut into the fossil layer. We know that this intrusion happened before the fossil layer, and we can further bracket that because the granite intrusion is probably going to have minerals we can date, and we know the age of the fossil bed, and so we can really kind of hone in on these ages. And if they line up, if this fossil bed has fossils that are younger than the age we get from this granite intrusion, then we know we're on the right track. And we can go ahead and use that same fossil bed unit all over the planet if we find it. So let's talk a little bit about the age of the Earth as we move into Earth history, because we're kind of winding down now. We've only got a few slides now. So the next lecture is going to be Earth history. And one thing I want to talk about with Earth history is that it is not short. And we know that because we know we have tree rings that go back thousands of years. We have varves, which are deposits in glacial environments where you have a glacial lake that freezes and thaws every year. And sediment is going to be deposited in the summer, and different sediment will be deposited in the winter. So we often get these like different layers where oxidized sediment might be deposited in the summer when the lake is not frozen and there's an equal exchange of oxygen between the lake and the atmosphere. And so that oxygen dissolves in the water and oxidizes the sediment. And then that lake freezes, And so that sediment is not oxidizing because underneath that ice, there's not as much oxygen being dissolved in the water. And so that sediment dissolves as a darker sediment. And we get these repeating patterns. And each one of these light, dark, light, dark, light, dark is a summer, winter, summer, winter, summer, winter, summer, winter. And some of these varves go for tens of thousands of years, right? So we know that, there are certain rock formations that can record 10 to 20, maybe even more, thousands of years of deposition. And then also, just based on the plate tectonics that we looked at in the first unit, we know that the plates are moving very slowly. We can measure those rates based on, remember, the paleomagnetic anomalies and whatnot. And so we know that based just on the distance of Africa from South America, for example, or Europe from North America, we know that tens, if not hundreds of millions of years have gone by just since the separation of Pangaea, not to mention other supercontinents that formed before that. So we know for a fact that the Earth has been around for a long, 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 long time, even without using radiometric dating. And we do have some radiometric dates of some rocks. I think the oldest ones are some zircon grains in a sandstone in Australia, and they're about something like 4.2 to 4.3, maybe even more, billion years old. And that's based on the uranium and lead ratios that are captured inside those zircon crystals. So the Earth has been around for a very long time, and that's given life a lot of time to evolve. I mean, it's in geology we really think about these timescales really easily. We get used to throwing around millions of years, but if you really stop and think about what that kind of time really looks like, certainly the process of evolution begins to make a little bit more sense, because it really does take a huge amount of time for the kind of slow adaptations that take place in biological structures that can start to lead to speciation and diversity. So how do we know the age of the Earth? Well, we get meteorites. So meteorites are not subject to plate tectonics. They're not subject to the rock cycle. The meteorites that are flying around in our solar system formed about the same time as the rocky planets did. And every meteorite that we age date, that we find, is right about 4.56, 4.59 billion years old. And we assume that these rocky bits were accreting around the solar nebula the same time as the Earth. Then we also have moon rocks. The moon collided with us about 4.5 billion years ago, early on in fact, if there was a planet that was cooling before the moon, or before the moon formed, that early Earth that was much smaller, whatever Mars-sized planet came and hit us and formed the Earth and the moon would have reset all of the radiometric minerals present. Everything would have melted and started to recool. And all moon rocks basically date at about 4.5 billion. So the moon cooled about 4.5 billion years ago, and subsequently we think so did we. And then we do have those rocks. Here's those sandstones in Australia. And they date to about 4.03 billion years, and the grains date to about 4.4 billion years. Okay. So that's geologic time and how we get at some of these absurd dates that we throw around. And these numeric dates were added after the time scale was established using relative age dating. And what's really crazy is guys like Hutton and subsequent sedimentologists put together all this stuff just based on relative age dating. But then when they started to do absolute age dates on this stuff, where they found intrusions cutting across the Cambrian, or volcanic ash in the Triassic, or something like that, they found that the order that they had put everything in corresponded exactly to the ages that they were getting from radiometric dating. So pretty cool. And so that's the geologic timescale as we have it today. And that's going to be our next lecture. Here's a kind of cool cartoon with the Archean and the Proterozoic, which represent 80% of the Earth's history, but there wasn't a lot of life, so we don't make as big of a fuss about it as we do everything after the Cambrian. And here's some fossils that we find in some of those different layers. And those major divisions of geologic time, like I said, are the Precambrian. That's the birth of the planet to the appearance of complex life. It's about 85% of the Earth's history. Yeah, it represents about 4.1 billion years. Then we've got the Cambrian explosion, named after Cambria in Wales, which is where the first rocks containing the earliest fossilized evidence of complex life was first studied. Then we've got the Ordovician and the Silurian, named after some Celtic tribes, we find lots of particular types of fossils there. Then the Devonian, that's named after Devonshire, England, where those rocks were first studied. The Mississippian, which is named after a place in the Mississippi, Pennsylvania, and so on. So I'll let you read through the rest of that. These names get their names from where the rocks that date them are first studied, and we call these type localities. That's why sometimes you'll have something like I mentioned earlier, the Morrison Formation, which is that red sandstone that Red Rocks is carved out of that we find all over the American Southwest. The reason we call it the Morrison Formation is because it was found in Morrison, Colorado. That's where Red Rocks is, and that's where that rock was first studied. So whenever you see a name like Pennsylvanian, that's because they studied it in Pennsylvania first. Or the Jurassic, that's because it was studied in the Jura Mountains in France and Switzerland, right? That sort of thing. So that's where all these names come from. And in the next lecture and final lecture of this class, we're going to talk about Earth history. It's a much shorter lecture, you'll be happy to know. And that's where we're going to start to talk about these eras in great depth and the kinds of life and the kinds of events that happen and how we separate these different periods from one another. So with that, I will sign off. This was a long one, but a lot to cover. So thanks for sticking with me and enjoy yourselves. I will see you next time. Bye-bye.